Frank Booth had a boat called the Queen Esther, which was about a 40-foot boat, and they started fishing using the techniques that they had in Monterey, which was either a beach seine, which was very crude fishing, or they used a gill net, which was almost impossible to catch sardines because the schooling fishes did not swim in a straight line. So they determined that the type of fishing equipment that they had in Monterey was not the right kind of fish, and so Pietro Ferrani explained to Frank Booth that there was a net that they used in Sicily and North Africa called the Lampara net. And the Lampara net was a net that had been used in the Mediterranean for thousands of years. And they were well acquainted with how it was used and how it could be used in Monterey. So they sent away to Frank Cardinale in Africa, in North Africa, to send a Lampara net. And when it arrived, they immediately put it to use. But in the problem with the net that came from North Africa was that the thread that they used on the net was so small or thin that the large schools of fish in the 10 or 15 or 20 ton range ripped the net to shreds. In North Africa or in Sicily, if you caught a couple of 100 pounds of fish, that was considered big. So they had the right net, but they had the wrong strength of thread. So they had enough of the net left to use as a pattern. And so Pietro Ferrani went up to San Francisco to the ship chandlery there on Green Street, and they got the right kind of thread, which was heavier, much stronger, and they reconstructed a new Lampara net. And once the net was complete, it took them a month or so to put it together. It has to be hung correctly with the floats, the corks on the top line and the lead line at the bottom. And the net is constructed so that when the fishermen start to pull in the net after they've surrounded a school, it snaps shut and traps the fish. And the Lampara net then became successful. They were able to catch 5, 10, 15 tons of fish at a time. And when Frank Booth understood that this was the type of fishing with the Lampara net, that his cannery could then start to expand. Once he was able to expand his cannery and hire more people to process the fish, the sardine industry was born. And at that point, Pietro Ferrani and Orazio Enea were fishing with the one boat, and the second season that they fished, which would be 1906, Pietro Ferrani had one boat and Orazio Enea had his own boat, and they brought in a third person, Erasmo Esposito. And so there was 3 families fishing in 1906, each had their own boat. And with 3 boats and the Lampara nets that they constructed, they were able to bring in enough fish to the Booth cannery that Frank Booth's cannery grew exponentially. And in the next 10 years, the Sicilian fishermen in Isola della Femmine and the rest of the fishing villages in the northwest corner of Sicily had been contacted about the growing sardine industry in the city of Monterey. And so more families came from Sicily to Monterey. And by 1910, there was over 12 families fishing in Monterey at that time. So there were other cannery owners or potential cannery owners saw that the industry needed more canneries, and then the first cannery was built, I believe, it was 1912, which is now Cannery Row. And within 5 years, as soon as World War I came, the war blocked all the fishing in the Atlantic, and so the market for sardines, canned sardines, for the war effort was supplied by the sardine industry of Monterey. And at the end of World War I, the sardine industry had been established. Several canneries were now built on Cannery Row, and Frank Booth's cannery continued to operate right there at Fisherman's Wharf until 1940. In the early days, they would take the nets up on the wharf, Fisherman's Wharf. There was only one wharf at that time. If a net had to be tanned, which was the case once a month, they had to tan the nets using tan bark. The fish had a slime on their skin, and it was very corrosive. And over a period of time, if they didn't keep their net clean, the net would begin to rot. So what they did was dip the whole net into a solution of tan bark, which would penetrate the fibers of the thread of the net and keep it strong so that it wouldn't fall apart. And that was probably one of the reasons why the first Lampara net fell apart, because it hadn't been tanned and fell apart, but also the weight of the fish in the early days. So the use of the Lampara net revolutionized the fishing industry on the West Coast up until the 1920, 28, 29 season, when the purse seine net was introduced. If you can imagine a rectangle about a quarter mile long, in other words, if you had the one end of a typical purse seine net at the start of the Fisherman's Wharf and stretched it out all the way to the intersection of Franklin and Alvarado Street. That's about a quarter mile or maybe a little bit more. That's about the average size. Some were smaller, some were larger, depending on the size of the purse seiner. And the height of the purse seine net was at least 10 stories high. And at the top of the purse seine net was a cork line, and they were attached to a rope that was attached to the net, and that would keep the net afloat. And at the bottom of the net was a lead line. And below the lead line, which would keep the net hanging in the water, and below the lead line was a purse line, and there were steel rings all along the bottom of this purse seine net. And within the steel rings was threaded a purse line. Usually in the beginning it was hemp rope, very heavy, 2.5 inches. Later it became steel. The sardine industry was front page news in the Herald every day. They would report what was happening on the waterfront. And then starting in 1936, there was a special edition to the Monterey Herald at the end of each sardine season, and that was generally 14 to 16 or 18 pages long. And the articles described how that season went, and all kinds of articles about the sardine industry, from the canning to the personalities involved. Once the season was over, you either went fishing for tuna in San Pedro or Mexico, or in the summer in June, before the sardine season started, they would go to Alaska for a month and a half. And that changed when in 1935, when Oregon and Washington passed legislation allowing canneries to be built on the waterfronts in the main fishing towns, because Washington and Oregon up to 1935 did not have sardine canneries. They had salmon canneries. The last good year was 1950, and by then many of the boat owners realized that the worst had happened, that the sardines had disappeared, and some of the smart ones had sold their boats earlier to other ports, usually San Pedro, because the sardines were still being fished in San Pedro. A couple of enterprising boat owners, of course, they had insurance for their boats. They would say they were going to take the boat up to San Francisco to dry dock, and all of a sudden they would put out a mayday call because their boat was sinking. What they had done is open the seacocks and sunk their boats for the insurance. To give you an example, in 1956, my grandfather lost the family boat, the Aeneas, to the bank. And in 1956, it was sold at auction, and a local party boat owner named Wheaton bought the boat and was taking the boat up to San Francisco to have it worked on. And the engine room began to flood, and I don't think he was doing it for the insurance because he only had $20,000, and the value of the boat was over $40,000. So the boat sank about 7 miles off of Moss Landing, and it was in the front page of the Monterey Herald, and my grandfather saw that, and once he understood that the boat was gone, he was in sad shape. He died shortly after that.